Hello, welcome to Practicing Life podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Pitzer, and I want to welcome back Sara Intonato. She is a successful neurodiverse parenting consultant and coach who works with children, parents, and organizations, helping the neurodiverse community thrive. She was previously on this podcast talking about how it's possible to be self-employed with a financially prosperous business while raising a neurodiverse child. In case you'd like to listen to that episode in conjunction with this one, please check out episode 49. Today, Sara is with us to discuss her upcoming release of her book, which no doubt is going to be about neurodiverse. So, welcome, Sara.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It's such a pleasure to be here once again.
Oh, I love having you. And we talked about this before, but I love your energy. I love what you stand for. I'm so glad to have you. And, and just my personal opinion, my perspective, I don't think that there's enough resources for neurodiverse families out there. And there's so many things, I'm going a little off topic here, but there's just so many things that people don't know about. And I'm going to tell you, for instance, for any of my audiences, like if you're listening for the first time, I have two neurodiverse children. And they're on opposite sides of the spectrum because it's a spectrum. So I have one that's, high functioning, low functioning, if you want to categorize it that way or picture it that way. But this week, literally this week, my kid is starting school and I noticed that my 14-year-old is getting armpit hair. Right. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm in lots of communities. I'm in communities in person in my local area. And I'm also on Facebook communities. I mean, this is something that I, as a parent, invest my time and energy in because I want to support my child as best as possible. But I've not heard anybody talk about armpit hair. And so I'm on YouTube Googling, what do you do about armpit hair? How do you handle this situation? We talk in person with my friends. We talk about what do you do with their hormones? What do you do when they start their menstrual cycle? What do you do for the school situation? But nobody was talking about armpit hair,
It's true. I have a 12 and 13-year-old. My 13-year-old son is neurodivergent. And that's one of the reasons why I found a health and puberty expert and had her on my podcast, which is the Full Potential Thriving with Neurodiversities podcast. And I'll send you the episode, Ashley, because I've got you. Because I, as a parent, was figuring out how to teach my 13-year-old who has limited verbal ability about puberty without having to deal with awkward situations with him being in school or amongst friends and not being prepared. And there were very limited resources for me. And I live in New York. And I realize it's not that there are limited resources, actually. It's that people aren't talking about them because it's an awkward conversation to have. And doubly so when you have to teach your child about it in a different way. And I just decided I was going to do this myself. So I found a health and relationship coach who specializes in that for people with neurodiversities and disabilities. Her podcast episode was one of my favorites because after the episode came out, I got more responses from listeners saying, thank you so much. That was the episode I didn't even know I needed. I didn't know people could even help me with that. It answered so many questions. And this was parents of kids starting at 8 and 9, all the way up through adulthood, dealing with anything from, hey, my older sibling has body hair. What's that about? To, hey, I'm in my 20s and how do I approach having a healthy relationship? So I think it's great for families to know that there are resources out there. You might have to look a little harder, unfortunately, but I'm here to change that. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote my first book, Emotional Healing for Parents of Children with Autism, because when my son was diagnosed, he was 2. This is going back 11 years. And I had no problem finding books about how to help him, how to clean up his diet, for example, how to look for certain types of therapies or supports. But I was really surprised that there was no book for me, the parent, to support myself. And I'm a reader. So I looked for the book. And then next year I looked for the book again. And then the next year I looked for the book again. And it didn't exist. And thankfully, I've always been deeply rooted in my spiritual practice, my self-care. So 10 years later, the book still didn't exist, I finally thought, it's time to write this thing myself. So that's essentially what I did, because I was noticing that parents were doing whatever it would take for their kids to thrive, but they were not thriving themselves. And they weren't making the connection that eventually you will be the bottleneck in your child's growth if you're constantly emanating stress and overwhelm and they feel that from you. If your ability to do what I call next level parenting for your child with needs is inhibited because you're too exhausted or depleted in some way and you just don't have that extra to give, your child will be the one who feels that or is on the tail end of that. And I am here to sort of shake parents up a little bit and say, hey, listen, so great that you're doing anything and everything for your kids, and they will do so much better in the long term because you've healed yourself. And that's really what I'm about and what the book is for.
I love that. I think when my child, well, when we were just starting to get into services, because there was a wait period for it, and my child, when they were born, it was clear to everybody but me, because I was in denial, that there was something that wasn't working physiologically for my child. It took me a long time to come to terms with that. But once I started to get into case management, I had an older woman who also had a special needs child, a neurodiverse child, and they talked to me. And maybe this is different now because we're, again, going back 10 plus years. And they had told me for every year of caregiving, you're taking a minimum of 3 years off of your life. So, like, really think about your self-care. And
Pause for a minute.
okay.
That, because I've never heard that officially, and it makes so much sense that that would be true. For every year of caregiving, you're taking 3 years off of your life if you're not also caring.
Combating that.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And despite hearing that, and despite having some reference of what that meant, I was so wrapped up in the whole story of like everything I have to do, everything I have to figure out. I wasn't even processing still at that point, even hearing this. So with hindsight, that I'm like, oh, because, I got to a point, for my audiences, I got to a point where I wasn't self-caring, and it was causing my problems for my children. So what Sara is talking about and what she's wanting to help you avoid, I'm going to tell you from personal experience. I had to get to that bottleneck point, and to that point where my kids were now suffering because I wasn't taking care of me before I initiated change. So like Sara, I am like a big advocate on self-love. I am so about self-love and self-care. And I 100% believe it is the foundation for everything. And I've mentioned this in my other episodes, but my older kid, the one that is so book smart, but maybe not have the social skills or some of the other skills going on, like that kid ended up suffering from like self-harm behavior and stuff like this, because I was carrying around all of this anxiety and uptight and worrying about everything, and like worrying about the grades, worrying about them fitting in, worrying about whether or not they have any friends. Like I was projecting all of these emotions onto my kids that they weren't able to handle and process.
Yeah.
And I can see the evidence of it. I wonder, you, my audience, can you see the evidence of this in your life where your kid is picking up on your anxiety, and do you start to see behavioral changes? Do you start to see them acting up? Do you start to see them getting louder?
Well, when Rocco was 2, I serendipitously, you and I know it's not an accident when someone comes into your life at the right time. I met someone who is still my mentor today in a method called relationship development intervention, which is intended to support individuals and families with autism, but I think it can really support a wide range of people. She was working with me and my 2-year-old at the time, and said to me, Sara, if Rocco isn't responding to you, if something isn't clicking here, he is not the problem. You are the problem. And of course, that was like a 2x4 to the face. Like, what do you mean? I'm here doing all the doing, trying to make everything perfect for him. But she really encouraged me to reflect and look at not how much I was doing, but the energy from which I was doing it, because that's what he was feeling and connecting with, not my to-do list being checked off, but my energy. And, I've seen many families try to avoid, like you said, you were in denial in the beginning. If this is where you are now and you're listening to this, please don't judge yourself, because I think this is something that many parents have to rumble with and work through. But what I see happening is often people who work through it enough to function, but they don't really give themselves the grace or the space to grieve the expectations that they had for their life that don't apply anymore, the dreams that they have to let go of to embrace different dreams. And my life is a great example of that. I have a wonderful, joyful, peaceful life that looks completely different than I imagined it would when I was first, a newlywed and having babies and all that. But the grieving process was essential. It allowed me to open up to the idea that something different or better was here for me during my lifetime. And when I see people who don't allow themselves that time and space to grieve, many moms don't, because they feel like, well, I can't grieve. I'm the glue holding the family together. If I let myself fall apart, everyone's going to fall apart. So they don't take the space. They just keep chugging along. And as a result, consume themselves with being busy, being overwhelmed, because if you're really busy doing things 24/7, you don't have to feel your feelings because you're too busy to feel your feelings. And you can't outrun your feelings, and you can't outrun those things within you that need to be processed and moved. And it doesn't mean it has to be scary or ugly, but you do have to let yourself hit the pause button to say, hey, wait a minute, what's really happening here inside of me that I might need to be with? And for me, I felt like when my kids were really little and Rocco was newly diagnosed, I knew I needed to do something to heal from what was a massive detour in my life and learn to embrace it. I personally didn't feel like I was able to do that in the confines of my house where everyone needed me and my kids were babies. They were depending on me all the time. And I was, of course, concerned for how my husband was handling things. And I said to my family, hey, listen, I can tell I'm not coping. I can tell I'm not really functioning in a way that I know is my best. And I know I want to do that again. So I'm going to hit the pause button on my life here and go to see my spiritual teacher in India, which is what I always did, and immerse myself in spiritual study to learn and grow who I am. And that meant leaving 2 toddlers and a husband and going halfway across the world by myself. And the minimum term of study to do this with my guru was 1 month. So I look back, I'm like, oh, that was ballsy, because I didn't know what it was going to be like to go there without children. I'd always anticipated bringing my children with me when I went back after having kids. And at the same time, I knew, what's the worst that can happen? All hell breaks loose at home. You're in India, you book a flight home, you're home in 24 hours. What's the big deal? What do you really have to lose? And I chuckle at myself because I knew I had healing to do, and it felt really big, and it felt really like there were a lot of emotions to move. And when I actually was by myself in India, immersed in my spiritual practice, I feel like I did my healing in about a week.
Oh, that's amazing.
Really, because I had the space. I was using tools that calmed and steadied my nervous system. I was taking a break from the busyness of life, so I was able to sleep and process what I needed to. And simple things like make sure I was hydrated, make sure I was rested, make sure if something was coming up, I could talk to my close friend about it, who I was traveling with, and doing things that were supportive of me. And when I really gave that to myself, it did not take long. I think people in their mind, especially if you've been avoiding your healing for a while, make it feel bigger than it is. Like, what if I need to immerse myself in healing for a year? Or what if I need to, go to a retreat that's completely silent for a month. And maybe you do, who knows? But I think it may not be as big and scary of a job as you think it is when you're anticipating it. Just like, when you have a busy day at home and you blurt out to someone like, oh my God, I've got to check a million emails, which are actually 12 emails, right? I've got to check a million emails and make dinner and do all these things. And it feels like this is going to take hours and hours and hours. And if you actually just give yourself the space you need, it takes an hour and a half, but in your head, you've been making it to be this big thing. We do the same with our own needs. And yet, when we actually give ourselves the time and space we need, it's really not that intimidating. The idea of taking the time is way more intimidating.
It's all the stories about taking the time and what it's going to mean that is the draining process.
Right.
You could have been done and over with it in the 5 minutes, whereas you spent 30 minutes circling around how this is going to impact and catastrophically thinking.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, you were able to pause, and I kind of just feel like that's because you are somebody who's really self-aware. And I'm also a person who's high on self-awareness and reflection. Now, not every single person really is this way, but let's talk about, because you work with hundreds of clients, hundreds of parents, and you have for years. What do you see the difference in? Do all of your clients, are you able to get to the point with all your clients that they're able to pause? Are there some clients that don't? Can you speak about the differences that you see there?
Sure. I do see differences because I work with non-speakers, individuals, children and adults, and I work with parents separately. And I'm actually in the process of changing that now to spend more of my energy working with parents, because what I've seen is that many parents who invest the time and resources in getting their child non-speaking or otherwise supports they need are very rarely also supporting themselves. It kind of becomes another thing for their kid to do and allows the parent to feel like they're
like successful at helping their kid.
Right. Behind the scenes, though, what I have seen is that many of these parents who are doing the things for their kids, they love them, they care for them, they are investing their time and energy and money and helping them, have PTSD actively, have major health challenges going on actively. They are not functioning. And I've seen not functioning even basic of ways, like not checking their emails for days and weeks at a time, missing important communications because they're just so tapped. And I say this without judgment. Raising a child with needs is something that unless you're doing it, you really cannot understand what it's like. And if you're not healing and not prioritizing your own well-being, it can and will consume you.
It gets overloading. Yes.
If you allow it to. If you don't act like the person who takes a stand and says, hey, my well-being matters, I'm going to put some energy into this over here for a while, even if it's 30 minutes a day, raising your child with needs can and will consume you. So I actually, pretty early on in the process of working with non-speakers, put up some boundaries and said, hey, listen, if you're signing your kid up to work with me, you have to consent to doing a handful of coaching sessions yourself. They're built into your package. They're not optional, because it makes no sense for me to come in and help your kid who lives in a house with you 24 hours a day if the energy in the house is not supportive of their journey and yours, because you also deserve to thrive in this lifetime. And I've seen a marked difference between the parents who step up and raise their hand and say, hey, Sarah, I recognize there are new places I want to go in my life. I would like to work with you as my coach. Those people have a different level of awareness around their deservingness to thrive, their choices that they make to support themselves, their commitment to doing that, even when the going gets tough, versus the people who make it all about their child, but are not yet ready to admit that they need to be a meaningful participant in this whole process. And this is really why I resonated with relationship development interventions so much, and why I'm actually now getting certified in it myself. It was the thing that helped my child. It was also the thing that helped me be a guiding force in his life, because I was able to be present. I was able to stay cool when things got intense. I was able to check my energy and develop a confident, trusting relationship with him. But I meet a lot of families who are sort of taught early on of like, you're just the parent, you don't know anything. Just hand your kid over to the experts. And that's that. And so I say that because it's not their fault if they don't realize that they're needed as meaningful participants in this process. They've kind of been trained not to be. And so I am here for the parents who recognize, I want to be a meaningful participant. I want to really thrive alongside my child, because we'll go so much further that way. And I've openly said to some parents of kids I work with, it's time for you to get a therapist now who specializes in what you're going through, whether it's a certain health challenge, whether it's raising a child with medical complexities, which is something that, I don't understand. I have a child with autism and needs, but I'm not dealing with seizures every day, or a child who needs insulin every day, or things like that. So I've openly said to parents, you're not ready for coaching yet, or you're in a cycle of perpetuating more challenges for yourself because you're in such active PTSD. I've been in PTSD before as a parent. I know what it feels like. I can see it. And when I have a relationship with a family, I don't shy away from saying those things like, hey, bottom line, if nothing else changes, even if your child doesn't thrive more because you've healed, which I know they will, you deserve to heal anyway. So why not?
This is one of the reasons I just absolutely adore you, because tough love is love. And we don't always have that person in our life that is giving tough love. I'm going to speak with my own experiences, and I always believe in being vulnerable. And I also believe in sharing my stories because I think it helps people relate and put things into perspective. But like, for instance, on the tough love, with my friends, they were just like, oh man, like I feel for you, or, oh, you've got it so bad. And that kept me personally with the way I acted in self-pity. Self-pity does not do you any favors, let me tell you, honey. Nothing good comes out of self-pity. But in the meantime, it kept me in this low vibration and seeking this type of attention. And I was there for a really long time. And I want to speak to on a second topic, because what Sara was kind of talking about is whether it's unconscious or you're unaware, when you're all worked up, whatever you're experiencing, if you're not in a good, healthy, emotional and mental place, it is like creating a toxic environment for your kid. Now, in relationships with marriages, we talk about this all the time. We talk about narcissism, and that's a toxic relationship, but we don't talk about the type of toxicity that is created for the environment for your kid. And it's not that you are intentionally trying to cause self-harm. It is just that lack of awareness, that lack of education on the fact that, like, when you're snapping at your kid because you're at your end and you're so tired. And I get it, because I've been there, and I created a toxic environment for my kids because I was so tired, because I was so worn out, because they followed me to the bathroom, to the shower, and I couldn't leave them alone for a second. And because I would wake up with my kid in the middle of the night with health issues, and I was just, doing the best that I could. That's how I was operating. I was just doing the best that I could. I wasn't thinking about the whole picture. I was thinking about moment by moment by moment. And I just encourage everybody who is out there, because I know what it's like to feel like I'm just surviving. I'm just doing the best that I can. Like Sara mentioned, the emails get mixed. I get it. I get multiple texts a day from my teachers and trained professionals that struggle with my kid, wanting to know, what do I do? How do I help this? And I'm working on my business, and I'm getting texts, and I have to know everything going on, right? You can start carrying all of this load, and you don't realize that this load has a consequence, and that consequence is how it's affecting your energy, how it's affecting you as a person, how you are reacting. And sometimes we create this unintentional negative place And it all can be resolved just by taking the time to like pause, like Sarah's saying, taking the time to self-care, taking the time to like put it into perspective. Like really, one of the things that my mentor says all the time is in life, there's really only like 5 big, points in your life that have pivotal moments, but yet we take every single tiny decision and explode it out like this is so life-threatening. And it's not. And so putting it in a perspective and saying, can this let go? Can I do this differently? And I just want to encourage all of you out there, because I know I've done it. And Sarah helps people do this for a living. So plug for her, because she can help you. It is totally worth it, because not only does it help you, I can personally tell you from my own personal experiences, when I changed my behavior, when I changed and made time for myself, I could immediately see the difference in my child's behavior. I could immediately see the difference in their scoring at school and their behavior at school. I could immediately see getting less text from the teachers. I could just, everything. Every aspect of my life became better. Their eating habits became better. Their sleeping behavior became better. And that's what I think that it's so hard sometimes to see, because we just get so like, I'm living in this moment. I'm just trying to survive. And when you can pause it, and when you can break that structure, and you can walk away from it, and you can look at it with fresh eyes, with sleep, because my goodness, sleep is so, so important for your ability to function. Imagine how different your life will be, and how much different it will make a difference in your child's life.
I think you hit on something, how when you changed your behavior, everything around you started to change. And that's because your vibration changed, but it's also because you were no longer, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, so please correct me if I'm off the mark here with you personally. This is something that I've seen, is that when parents are not caring for themselves, their only objective in the day is to care for their children, really. And that means their only source of self-worth is how their child is doing. So child has a bad day at school, parent beats themselves up. Child has a tough night of sleep, parent assumes they're at fault and must, beat themselves up again. And so it almost becomes this constant cycle of finding more and more things to beat yourself up about.
And keep yourself busy. In a different way.
Yourself busy with. Whereas when something as small as you take a walk around the block for some movement and to refresh your brain with some air and change of scenery on a really intense day, from that one simple thing that might only take 10 minutes, you've accomplished something. You have cared for yourself. You have refreshed your body and your mind so that whatever you're going back to can be handled with fresh eyes and fresh energy. And those little pieces of accomplishment go a long way in reminding yourself, oh, hey, I'm worthy. Look at what I'm accomplishing. I could have done nothing for myself today. And instead I went out and I took a walk around the block. And that sense of achievement bolsters you and will give you more energy. And this is a really key point, because parents, we think about codependency in relationships with adults, right? But parents do become codependent in their relationships with their children. And we see this a lot with kids with needs who have a slower path to independence. And I see often parents get so caught up in being the caregiver, they're just so used to that being their source of self-worth and their source of love. Oh, my child will love me because I make sure their bed is made perfectly, or because I make them their favorite food for dinner. And you also have to think about what happens to your child when they're an adult and they don't know how to make their own bed because you always did it. And they don't know how to make their own meal because you always did it. And I have, of course, a neurotypical child as well. And I find this to be true for both my children. And I remember it was during the pandemic, pandemic parenting, you're doing everything for everybody the first couple of months at least. And I remember my daughter coming to me and saying, Mom, I'm hungry. Can you make me some breakfast? And I said, I'm in a virtual class with your brother right now. I can't do it now. You can either wait an hour and then I can do it for you, or you can make something yourself. She was 8 years old at the time. So she went on YouTube, figured out how to poach an egg, and made herself a beautiful avocado toast and poached eggs. Perfect on the first try. And it became her favorite thing to do. And it became her favorite breakfast. And she was so proud of it. And I thought, wow, I could have felt guilty for not being available in the moment to make my 8-year-old the breakfast that she wanted. But look what came out of that. She became independent. She felt proud of herself. She was able to fill a need herself. And she didn't need to depend on someone else. And in this small, age-appropriate, healthy example of learning how to make your own breakfast, I wasn't asking her to do her taxes herself. She was only 8 years old. But, it was an important moment for me to reflect and say, so often parents beat themselves up because their child has to wait for something and they can't be available right then because they're doing their workout or they're busy doing something else for their career. And look at the good things that come out of your child having to wait or be self-reliant or take the time to figure things out. And I see this with my neurodivergent child as well. So if you're the parent who feels a little guilty stepping away to take the walk around the block or go to an acupuncture treatment or get on your yoga mat or get enough sleep, just remember the great gift you're giving your children by not only showing them, hey, I believe in you, you're capable of figuring this out by yourself with the right supports for your child's needs, but think of the example you're setting for them of, hey, when you're an adult and everyone's depending on you, you're still worthy of not stressing yourself out, caring for yourself, putting yourself higher on the ladder, not at the bottom. And what an important lesson to teach the next generation of people.
Yeah. And your example is about empowering your child. And that's a beautiful thing. And one of the lessons that I had to learn is at some point, I just stopped trusting that my child could do X, Y, and Z. And that was a real big life lesson for me. And it wasn't, and I'm telling you, because I don't know what age your child is that is listening, but it wasn't until I got to a point where I'm like, man, if my child could just have a little bit of independence, like what this could offer me. And, I'm working with therapists and doing this and that. Like now, when my child is much, much older, and in my example, I don't know what you're experiencing, but in my example, my child was glued to my side, always touching my shoulder, always grabbing my arm, touching me while I'm eating, like everywhere. Like I said, when I went to the bathroom, there was just always there, waking up in the middle of the night to come find me, right? This is what she's talking about, this dependency, right? This codependency. And I played into it 100%. I did. I will acknowledge that. And it wasn't until my kid was so much older. I mean, my child is now like 14. And I was like, oh, there was no independent skills because I was doing everything. And I wasn't trusting my child to learn the skills. And I wasn't giving that tough love that we talked about in the very beginning. And that was a big lesson for me. And it has paid off so much now, now that I've changed my behavior, my perspective, and I'm not rushing over to solve every single problem and being the fixer. That is one of the most common type of parenting styles, whether it's a helicopter parent, a fixer parent, that is one of the most common things. And it is also training your child with what is expected out of them.
Yeah. I also want to point out that I have a client who's worked through this a lot, and she has beautifully grown and shifted. And now that she's done that, one of her reflections has been, I was the fixer parent because I was afraid, like you said, my child wouldn't make any friends. She was the kid who was bullied in school and neurodiverse. And
Mine too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I was afraid for her. I was afraid that she wouldn't find people who she connected with. I was afraid that she wouldn't be able to find her groove in class. And I was afraid of her growing up, and then suddenly being the kid in college with no friends, and being the kid out in the workplace who can't handle team projects, and I wanted to say that if you are hearing yourself be mentioned as the fixer as you're listening and go, oof, please know, Ashley and I know that probably comes from a loving place. It probably comes from a place of deeply caring and deeply being nervous about your child's ability to thrive on their own. And there's no shame in caring that much. And from a spiritual perspective, your child is here to have their own journey in this lifetime.
Very good point.
They chose you as their parent, not to make things perfect for them, because they have their own lessons to learn, just like you do, but to love and support them as they learn their lessons. But taking the lessons away doesn't serve them either, because they need to learn their own lessons. And that as a parent is so freeing and can feel so hard, because, you know, you don't want your child to get into a difficult spot. You don't want them to struggle. And yet, if I can look back at my lifetime, the most important lessons I learned were the ones that were intense. And you better believe when I learned those lessons, I learned them. I didn't have to go learn them again and again. It was like message received, got it, won't make that mistake again. But it didn't matter how many times my parents told me, didn't matter how many times I'd been warned about it. Sometimes I had to just go make my own mistakes. And it would have been a disservice to me if my parents had swooped in and tried to save me from all the lessons that I needed to learn. So I just want to remind you that though the fixing comes from a loving place, it's also not your job to control the lessons that your child needs to learn in this lifetime. What if they're exactly where they're meant to be? I have to remind myself of this a lot, having a child who has very limited speaking ability, who communicates in other ways. He's having the lessons he's meant to have in this lifetime. And whenever anyone in my life goes into pity for him, I remind them, don't feel bad for him. He has a great life. It might look different than yours, but he has a great life. And he's learning the things he needs to learn here with love and support. Doesn't mean they're easy all the time, but don't feel bad for him, because who's to say on a day-to-day basis he's not happier than you are, just because he doesn't verbalize that in the way you do. So if you're in that mode of fixing, I really am going to push you to ask yourself, what do you get from the fixing? What does the fixing allow you to continue to do or be? And who would you be without being the fixer?
Exactly. And then I want to ask you on your book, this book hasn't released yet. I believe it comes out September 24th.
26.
26. Okay. And so when this book gets out, do you talk at all about that whole like letting go? Because that letting go process, some of the reasons that people don't do it is because they have to sit in their discomfort and their unease with it. So does that go into that?
Yes. And the book is part memoir, telling my story of what I've done as a parent in an individual and how I've healed myself. And then the other part is how-to book, giving parents the tools to heal themselves. And a lot of that is turning your attention inward and looking at all of these things that are here for you and all these lessons that are here for you. And it does deal with letting go, but on various levels, letting go of the life you thought you'd have, embracing the one that's right in front of you, letting go of clinging to the past and worrying about the future so that you can be present, and letting go of the idea that now your kid's life matters more than yours because they have needs.
Good point.
Your life matters too. And as kids get older, there's an ebb and a flow, and there's no signpost that pops up and says, okay, now's the time where you start treating them like a baby. Now's the time where you let them make their own lunch or that you have them do their own laundry. There isn't. It's just something you as a parent have to feel out with your intuition, not with your fixing mentality, with your intuition. And a lot of the spiritual lessons in the book are about connecting to your intuition, because nobody knows your child better than you. Mm-hmm. And just because someone else comes in and says, hey, now you should have your child do XYZ, doesn't mean that's gospel. You get to decide as the parent, but you can't decide if you're going at 1,000 miles an hour or you're overwhelmed and can't make another decision. You have to first energize yourself and connect to yourself. So a lot of the letting go that comes through the book is the letting go of kind of that proverbial bag of rocks you've been carrying as the parent. And I recognize that parenting a kid with needs is a different journey than neurotypical parenting. I have one of each, so I know I have a bird's eye view. And maybe someone saying, hey, take off that backpack full of rocks and just throw it on the ground is not doable for your life at this time. But maybe you can take 2 rocks out of the bag today and then carry it a little further. And maybe you can take out another rock tomorrow and carry it a little further. And I really encourage people to read it with that mentality of this is not an all or nothing experience. And you get to go at the pace that is right for you. And you don't get to make yourself wrong if you can't take off the whole backpack all at once. You can do whatever you can, kind of like we were talking about before. Take that walk around the block for 10 minutes. Did you exercise for an hour and a half today and then meditate for an hour? No. Did you do 0? No. You did something. Something is better than nothing. Amazing. Keep doing something.
And celebrate those wins. Acknowledge it.
Yes.
Yeah. So I am also curious. One of the things statistically, and I haven't looked up the statistics in a while, so but the divorce rate is extremely high with families with special needs, neurodiverse children. Do you talk about that at all in the book? Do you talk about?
I do.
Okay.
I do. I talk about, I have a wonderful husband. We've been together for 21 years, married for 16 years, and not without challenges, because we got married as 26-year-olds, madly in love, met as college kids, and then life handed us a whole lot of adulting really fast. Had a baby, bought a house, had a second baby, first kid diagnosed with needs, all in the span of a couple of years. And I think I was 30. So it was a lot of adulting really quickly. And this book came to be because my spiritual practice is really what got me through that time. And my husband and I are still learning and growing. And in the book, I talk a lot about how as I cared for myself, I was able to zoom out and see the bigger picture of our life as a family and what was working well, what wasn't working well. I was able to communicate better about what wasn't working well so that we could address it. I was able to have a lot more compassion for my husband, who had his own timeline for grieving and healing, which was not my timeline. And I couldn't get mad at him for having his own timeline. He's entitled to have that. And I had to really be with my own discomfort of, hey, I'm over here and I want to go in this direction, and he's over here and he's not there yet. And how do we find common ground, especially because I love him? And where is that right mix of me loving him and also not being codependent with him, because we're in these different places in our healing journey. And it's messy. Relationships are messy on a regular day for regular people, if such a thing exists. Relationships are very messy when you have kids with needs that take a lot of your energy. And people who parent neurotypical kids will never understand how much energy it takes. And, I know that when people hear about that, they say things like, oh, well, just have more dates, just have more sex, just do all those like romantic things. Yeah, that doesn't hurt. But at the same time, you won't be able to communicate to your partner, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I need here. How can we work on that together if you're not first healing yourself? And I think that in my humble opinion, and I'm not a marital counselor, the only way to really have a successful marriage when you have a child with needs is to be really conscious of filling your cup, because you can't pour from an empty cup, whether it's pouring for your kid, pouring for your partner, pouring for your dogs, pouring for your house. You can't pour from an empty cup. And this is something that I still have conversations with my husband about. He's like, oh, I really missed you today, and let's hang out tonight. I'm kind of like, hey, have you done your workout yet? Because if you haven't, I'm going to say, I don't want to hang out with that depleted version of you, though I love you and I would love to be close to you, but like, no, time out. You need to go care for yourself. We can hang out tomorrow. And
I have to do that too.
yeah. And I think that it's really important to remember that a marriage is only as strong as the sum of its parts. And it can be so easy to want to blame your partner when things are in a challenging spot. And to anyone feeling that, and I've certainly felt that over the years, is you're part of that pattern.
And ultimately you're allowing it and agreeing to it.
So if you want the pattern to change, you might need to look at yourself and change your patterns so that the pattern of the house can change. And yeah, I've held some really uncomfortable boundaries around that, really uncomfortable. And at the same time, I had to ask myself, what's more uncomfortable? Holding this boundary so that we can move forward in a better way, or going back into the comfortable thing that's comfortable in the moment, but ultimately in the long term doesn't really heal anything. Right?
Yeah.
Uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I want to add, because you made several really, really wonderful points. And I just wanted to kind of add one aspect to it, because when you're in survival mode or you're not taking the time for you, for your own self-care, then you're not truly being present in whatever time you do spend with your husband. And I want to talk to you because even if you don't have a neurodiverse child and you're listening to this, you can so relate, because it would be the same thing about you're on a date with your husband and you're thinking about work problems. You're thinking about an unresolved conflict that you had with your coworker, and it's consuming your thoughts and it's consuming your energy. And yet you're just idly standing there with your partner and calling it a date. You know, like it's
Right.
the same type of mentality in your relationship with your marriage. It's just at a different level because you're also adding these different factors to your energy and to your being. So that self-care helps you get to that place where you're kind of cleaning the slate. So when both people clean the slate and they come in and they're actually present, you don't need to have like pre-kid level, like, you know, like your dates no longer match that same type of level of pre-kids and what it felt like to dating. You can get accomplished. Like there's times when I tell my husband, like our date is going to be a 15-minute conversation. And I just want to know about these things. And then afterwards, I'm going to go do this and he's going to go do that. And if we want to touch base again afterwards, great. But that can be a date for us because it's what's doable for us. And it still allows me to connect, because having even a 5-minute conversation where both people are totally present is so much rewarding than having a 2-hour, I watched a movie and had dinner and I stared at my husband.
Well, my husband and I have very different love languages. I feel like he could have a lot of love languages, but he is very, very into acts of service.
Oh, so is mine.
I bring him coffee in the morning in bed, just how he likes it. He's like,
right. And that did not take you that long.
Right. No. And physical touch is definitely one of his. And I am a quality time person. I want you to be off your phone and hold my hand. And if we're watching a movie together and that's all we're doing, I still want you to hold my hand and not be looking at your phone, because that's time with me. But I think learning the love language is important. And also earlier in this episode, you mentioned how important sleep is. And I wanted to echo that again, because my husband really struggled with sleep, being neurodivergent himself in recent years, in taking, I'm going to say without judgment, a little longer than he should have to deal with some of his feelings around, Rocco's diagnosis and his own well-being. And eventually not sleeping catches up with you. And so I put up some really uncomfortable boundaries in recent months and have said, hey, listen, if this and this and this don't get addressed, then these things are not going to be happening. Like, so you get to choose. So he addressed the sleep. He addressed a lot of things that he needed to for his own well-being, whether we were in a relationship or not. Like, he needs to be a sound human. And he did that. And we went out to dinner last week. And we were sitting outside by the water. We live in Montauk, New York, and sun setting. It's just so beautiful. And an hour into our meal, he said, "Hey, did you notice that I didn't text the babysitter at all?" He said, "I used to go on a date with you and spend the ride there while you were driving, like texting instructions that everyone already had, mind you, because he was worrying. And then as soon as I sit down and after washing my hands, like check in again. What are you doing now? How's it going?" And then after the appetizer comes, check in again. "How's it going now? Any updates? Do you need any help? Do you need any of this? Do you need any of that?" And I'm much more of the no news is good news mentality. And it was an hour into our meal. And he's like, "Did you notice I hadn't sent one message? I hadn't looked at my phone at all. That's because I feel rested because I'm actually sleeping now. So I'm not worrying about all the things that could go wrong. My mind is not spinning out. My nervous system is not fried. I'm so much more present with you. I'm looking at this beautiful sunset as we eat this beautiful meal. Wow." And I think this is an important thing to highlight because people, I think, in their minds can make healing a grandiose task or an expensive task. I've got to go to the therapist, doesn't take insurance, and pay $1,000 a session or what have you. All he did was tweak his sleep habits. That's free. And felt noticeable differences. I saw the differences. And those are just a few of the differences that he's seeing in his abilities being empowered and enlivened from that one simple thing of getting more sleep at night. So I bring that up too, because people's brains often go to the grandiose, complicated things that they might have to do to help themselves. What if drinking more water helps you today? What if one walk around the block? What if 30 more minutes of screen-free time before you go to bed helps you? These things are free. So don't overlook the free stuff or the simple stuff, much like in my many years of teaching yoga, people would ask me, how can I improve my mobility more? How can I improve my peace of mind more? You can do that by taking deeper breaths. You're already breathing. Just take a deeper one. Slow it down. Really visualize it coming in. Let your body absorb it. You will feel different, but you have to try it to know that. So don't overlook the simple things because they really do help.
I love that. I love your story with your husband. I'm so happy, you know, but I
Right.
also want to relate this too, because you talk about spirituality and you talk about it in your podcast, and it's a lifeline for you, you know, and it is for me too. I don't know who all is listening, but I just want to tie it back to that, because if you are walking the spiritual path, if this does speak to your heart, this is like the spiritual path is always like, it's like mentally, it's like taking the world and working backwards. It's going to simplicity. Like almost everything with spirituality is like, take it back to the simplest form, where our brains, if you go into like, you know, some of my past programs where I'm talking about how your brain works, your brain goes into, let's make it complicated. Let's go into that analytical brain. And so it's like almost the difference between your heart and your head. Like your brain, your analytical brain is going to be like, oh, well, this means this and this and this and this and this, and all of these thoughts are going exploding, right? And then if you get into your heart, it's like really simple.
Really simple. And I think part of the job of my yoga practice, and it could be meditation practice, it could be walking in nature, whatever your practice is that calms your nervous system, is bringing your vibration to a place where you can connect with the simple things instead of feeling frantic. And I think that's a highly overlooked thing, but kind of that feeling of taking a deep exhale and realizing like, oh, in this particular moment right now, all is well. And funny to think how there's work involved in doing that, because it sounds so simple, but when you've experienced PTSD, when your nervous system is fried, when you're in adrenal fatigue, the work really is in bringing yourself back to that state of harmony in body, in mind, in spirit, and allowing these simple things to work for you.
And to complement that, everything that Sara has mentioned, not only is it free, but it is all of these things that she has mentioned. It is about resetting your central nervous system. it's there for you to do. It's just a practice. And when we talk about hypnosis and we talk about how your brain works, how you really stop yourself from like spinning out of control or going into that anxiety is doing exactly that. Interrupting your central nervous system, doing a pattern interrupt. And everything that she has listed is doing that. And that is self-care and that is love.
That is self-care. That is love. And I also will say that giving yourself the time and space to do those things that can be very simple, but that bring you mental fortitude, maybe in addition to physical fortitude, are my guideposts in life. So, for example, many women are kind of indoctrinated with the idea that self-care is manicures and pedicures. Self-care is taking a bubble bath. I love those things.
Me too.
I love those things. And they are enjoyable. They are not necessarily the things that I personally need to build mental fortitude. My yoga practice, which is Ashtanga yoga, is my meditation practice is being out in nature and hiking a trail and moving briskly is. I'm, as Ashley and I were talking about human design before we started recording, I'm a projector, so I need my chill out time, but I find that if I try to take chill out time, my brain, if it hasn't done those calming activities first, is too wild to really appreciate the chill out time. So I need to calm and steady the nervous system first, and then I can chill with the best of them. But first I have to ground. And that's just me personally.
No, I love that you point that out because I'm a generator. So it works a little differently for me than it works for you. And if you guys haven't checked out human design, I haven't made an episode on every single human design thing yet. I should totally do that because I just absolutely love it, but it's worth looking into. And I'm going to kind of wrap up the episode because we're at an hour. But I just wanted to point out to everybody that is listening, if you have a neurodiverse child, please go to Sara's website. I will have it in the show notes. Reach out to her. Her book is coming out September 26th. It is called Emotional Healing
For Parents of Children with Autism.
Isn't that wonderful? And that's something that I hope that as you have listened to today's episode, you realize that this will be worthwhile for you. This is valuable for you. You are worth it. You are worth reading this, taking it in and absorbing it and putting it into practice. So is there anything else that you would like to say, Sara?
Just that if you're someone who listens to books, there will be an audio version of the book coming out. I know that many people who lead really full lives need that option and value that option. So that will be there for you. Doesn't matter how you consume books, I got your back. And you still deserve the time to absorb that for yourself. And I just want to once again highlight what a wonderful resource you all have in Ashley. She's just someone who really gets it and understands that delicate balance that you're seeking of having a life that is full of joy and also full of responsibility and prioritizing and caring for herself. So she is simply evidence that it's possible, and how amazing that she's a resource for you. So always look to her when you need a North Star, because she's there for you.
Thank you,
And thank
Sara.
you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And for all of those that are listening today, I always like to remind you that you matter and check out the show notes.